Frankie, can we close the door? And are you going to be behind it in case other people come, or? Yeah, let's go. Guys, do you want to take a seat or not? Are you going to? No. Tremendous. So good evening. Welcome, everybody. So we've got a couple of hours together and we're going to be talking about climate justice. We're going to be sharing our ideas. I think some people are coming from a position of great knowledge, other people less so, including myself. And so let's mix it up. Let's make this really educational for all. In terms of the agenda, so I will speak for a small amount of time. We're then going to get 4 esteemed panelists up on the stage. And each of those panelists will introduce themselves and they will then provide their perspective on climate justice. And then one by one, they'll engage with you through Q&A. So again, it doesn't matter if you're speaking from a position of strength or not. I'm sure if you ask a question, you'll be asking a question that other people want to hear the answer to. So please do. At the end of that, what we'd like to do then is, and hence the tables, for people to actually have a conversation together. So in small groups of 4 or 5, everybody, oh, good, it's fantastic. Everybody turn around, have a bit of a chat, introduce yourself to each other, and then talk about what you've heard, talk about your own perspectives. And I think also critically, talk about what we think we need now in terms of climate justice. At the end of that, a little bit of plenary feedback. So anybody who's got particularly good ideas, we want to hear them. And then we'll get Kumi Naidu to close, and that'll be it. Okay, big high fives all around. So that's what we're looking forward to in the next 2 hours. In terms of, this is very relaxed. So modus operandi, we're not in the blue zone here. So anybody wants to say anything at any time, obviously just shout out, get involved or heckle, whatever, that's all fine. So I'm Sam Baker, and the reason I'm standing in front of you is because I've been part of a little team of people, some of whom are here, and this was a walk to COP. So we, rather like a fellow journey person here, so we traveled from London to Glasgow. We arrived yesterday, 510 miles, 20 miles a day, and we're very pleased that we've got here and we don't have to walk today. And we did that really just to, like many of the other journeys and sort of pilgrimages and whatever, was to try and engage people in and around climate, some aspect of climate change and climate action. I think a lot of the focus of our engagement, so we tried to sort of blend it across stakeholders, of students, of companies, of government, of civil society or civil action groups. But a lot of the focus of that was really around perhaps the basics of emissions and the basics of adaptation. So that was quite a lot of the focus. But it became very clear as we walked through that actually the question of justice is a critical component to getting things done, not just a moral principle, but actually something really important to make sure that these things are actioned. And Kevin, if I can borrow something from Morecambe and the conversation there, I think one example of that was, and I'll get this wrong, but to paraphrase, the council has got a carbon budget. A decision has to be made around social housing, which includes a building of a motorway spur or a significant piece of infrastructure. This and this don't sit very comfortably together. Of course, you can work hard to try and make them work. This is a social issue, and here we have emissions reduction. So, it was a great example to me, a very obvious example, local example of a potential conflict, a potential trade-off, and something really that actually had to be managed to make sure that sort of transition to like a greener future was also had social justice at its heart. So it's just a small example. So, my background is in business, and the most recent thing I've done is get involved in an exercise which interviews companies about what they're doing about climate change. And, sort of 9 out of 10 or 95% talk about net zero emissions and emissions reduction. 5% talk about resilience or adaptation, roughly, as the most important things to them. And nobody talked about justice or work in the community. That's not to say nobody's doing that, because we know that they are, but they're not prioritizing it. So that sort of piece around justice, certainly in business, is very much a third or a distant third to the other 3. So just in terms of this, and we're going to hear from the panelists who I think some of whom are true experts in this. But my own framing of this particular issue is really then to say, if we think about justice, I suppose, as giving people or people getting what they deserve roughly, I think there are really three parts possibly to the climate story and climate justice. And the first is making sure that the innocent don't suffer. I think that's sort of really important. The second, that the polluter or the organization or the state or the entity which has caused an issue in some way pays or in some way helps remedy that. And possibly the third and probably the most difficult is that we don't leave anybody behind. So that SDG sort of type underpinning, which is leave nobody behind. And just to sort of go into each of those very, very briefly, I suppose in terms of the innocent suffering, I suppose climate change is all about the innocent suffering. It's all about next generation or the generation after, people who haven't partake or haven't contributed in any shape or form to what we're doing at the moment and what we've done in the past. And they're going to be on the receiving end of the challenges that climate change give rise to. So, we're not doing particularly well, certainly in that dimension. But it's not just future generations, obviously. There are other dimensions. So that's the majority versus the minority world, or the richer countries versus the less richer. I mean, that gets a lot more focus and a lot more airtime. That's still obviously a big, big issue. And we hope to see some progress against that in COP. But it's also within country, as we know, it's the rich and the poor, or perhaps should we say that, the well-resourced and the less resourced. People who can move, people who've got mobility, people who can secure the infrastructure around them. These people aren't going to suffer as much as the people who can't, who are stuck, who, build in floodplains, for instance, or whatever else it might be. And so I think it's future generations, it's cross country, but of course it's within country as well. And so all of those, I think, are, big challenges to making sure that the transition that we affect is actually just. And the second thing about, people sort of the polluter paying, or the person who's actually created some of the challenge, then actually paying for it. We know we've got various different mechanisms at a national level and a more local level. So, carbon tax, I think we're going to hear a little bit about that later as an example. We've got to move, or sort of stakeholder pressure, creating pressure on organizations to change, and particularly the carbon intensive industries. But I don't think we can really conclude at the moment that the polluter is necessarily paying, either at a national level or at a local level or at an organizational level. And part of my concern on this particular one is any sort of narrative which says, for instance, that in Kenya, it's okay to build the coal mine because, you need development, shorter, medium-term development, or in Tanzania, you invest further in the national gas and in the natural gas. My concern there is because there is a bit of narrative which says that's an easier source of energy. They need energy to power their economies, but it also makes them dependent on something which the rest of the world is moving away from, and the rest of the world is going to be penalizing them. So they won't have the infrastructure, the supply chain, the maintenance. They'll be supporting a moribund industry. And if you look at what happens in Poland, for instance, with the coal mines, you can imagine that playing out in those countries, isolated, the only people doing that. Right? And if it was only for internal use, that would be sort of okay, but you can't do that. You can't just keep it contained within a boundary. So that's a concern. I think that then the other bit about sort of polluter paying, I suppose, on the positive side, is I think we're getting far better understanding through reporting, through technology, of who the polluter actually is. So for instance, methane leaks and spotting those from space and understanding what piece of infrastructure is giving rise to that. So at least some of the tools are coming into play, which allow a little bit more justice against that particular suggestion of a way of gauging it. And the final one, which is leave no one behind, I'm really struggling. I think that's a concept. I think the SDGs obviously put that up as a primary concept. Really struggling to say that we've made any progress about that for the SDGs, let alone for climate. I've found it incredibly difficult to think, even conceptually, how we've done against that. So I'm looking forward to anybody else putting some good news on the table around that principle of leave nobody behind. But it is very challenging, I think, to the way that we've set ourselves up, the way we run the world, the way the world is run, to reflect or make some progress against that. So I guess in key point, I suppose, is that this isn't just a moral challenge, or it is something which is absolutely critical as we think about the transition and affecting the green transition. if we think about what might come next or some guides, and I hope we're going to hear from everybody today and get much better ideas than I can put on the table. But I think the first thing for me is certainly for business is that we've got to put adaptation and emissions right up in together. And then we've got to have that joined by justice. We've got to talk about those three things together. Businesses have to reflect on all of those and not just the first or the first and the second. They have to have an answer for justice. What is the impact of what you're doing on the communities that you serve through your products and services that you need as part of your supply chain? That's got to be a critical part of the conversation. So if anybody's familiar with corporate reporting, there's something called TCFD, lots of interest in that at the moment. That's all around emissions and a bit around adaptation. Doesn't really talk about justice unless it's a very critical risk or seen as a critical risk to the company. That's got to change. And the second thing I think is giving people a voice, which obviously is probably, well, not obviously, but it, is at the heart, I guess, of securing justice. And I think we've seen climate assemblies work to a greater or lesser degree. They've been quite popular in this country and some others, and we might hear about that a little bit later. But a climate assembly, to my mind, run well. The sortition sort of front end, really making sure it's fully represented or as fully representative as it can be, giving people a voice across different categories, I think is really, really important and at the heart of some form of justice solution. So with that, a low bar to allow everybody else to, have much better ideas. So please can I have the panelists up on the stage? Albert. Nice to see you all. I think it's pretty obvious. Stab the button to get the, twist the cap to get the water, stab the button to do the sound. So what I'd like to do, please, panelists, is just very briefly sort of name, organization, if that's what you want to say, one little personal snippet for people to remember you by as we go around, and then we'll come back to the beginning and we'll ask you, Laura, to start. Okay? Okay. So.
Can you hear me? Yeah, cool. I am Laura Bannister. I am the campaign director of World Basic Income. My personal snippet, I hate these personal snippets. It's the first time I've ever left my kids alone for the night without me. It feels highly luxurious. They're only 1 and 3.
My name is Father Abogast Lekule. Originally from Tanzania, born at the foothill of Mount Kilimanjaro. I work for the Catholic Church, the parish called St. Anselm's Tutinbeck, and I'm involved with a group known as Live Simply, and yeah, that's one of my main strengths and interests.
Hi everyone, I'm Jamie Cook. I'm head of RSA Scotland, so I lead our activity here, but also in a lot of global connections now. It's great to see so much activity and so many of our fellows involved in so many exciting ideas. I suppose snippets for me, one kind of funny one I always like is that I used to live upstairs from David Bowie, which is always great. Can't take any credit for having influenced his music, given I was only up to 2 at the time. And also I was really struck that I was talking to my daughter the other day about COP26, and she looked at me and just out of nowhere said, "You adults have really, really mucked up the planet, haven't you?" And I felt really guilty at that point. So I'm hoping for some really good answers today, so I can go back to her and say we've sorted it all.
Hi everybody, I'm Nicole Griffiths, and I'm a local councillor in the London Borough in London, so Lambeth in South London. I was elected 3.5 years ago, and I can't claim to be a climate justice expert anyway at all. If I wanted to know much more about it, I'm currently studying a master's at SOAS in anthropology of global futures and sustainability. So maybe in a year's time, you have to come back and learn a little bit more and maybe have an answer or two.
Very good. Kumi, do you mind just introducing yourself and then we'll come back to you at the end? Yep. Thank you, Kumi. Tremendous. Okay. So we're going to start left, go right. So Laura's going to say a piece. We're then going to ask her some questions, okay, or make some suggestions. So please, Laura, over to you. And yeah, whatever you want. You can stand here, sit there.
Right. I love Sam's t-shirt because and Natasha's t-shirt because I am also a stubborn climate optimist, and I'm also a stubborn policy optimist. So I'm going to jump right in there with what I think is the solution to climate justice. Obviously not the only solution, but one thing that I think is a huge and important and vital part of the solution. So climate justice there's two parts, right? There's climate. We're not going to have climate justice if we don't solve climate change. And then the second part is we're not going to get climate justice if we screw over the people that have been screwed over before and get screwed over every time, which is the people of the world who are living on low incomes, the people who've contributed effectively nothing to the problem of climate change. So that's what we're pitching for, is a solution that can address climate change without screwing people over, and preferably by supporting people that have been screwed over before. One policy that gets discussed when talking about how to address climate change is carbon cap and dividend. And so I think this is a fantastic policy. So this is where you cap total carbon extraction. You then charge a tax or a fee, whatever you want to call it, on the extraction that still happens, that's within the cap. The cap obviously lowers each year to reach net zero. And then the money from the fees, from the taxes that are paid on the carbon that is extracted, that money is given out to people as a dividend on an equal basis. So that is a brilliant policy that on its own goes quite a long way to climate justice. But it's almost always discussed on a national level. So one of the big places it's talked about is in the US and in Canada. Those are rich countries that use a lot of fossil fuels. They import a lot of fossil fuels, they extract some fossil fuels, they burn a lot, and they live extravagant lifestyles like we do here in the UK on the back of that. Because of that large amount of fossil fuels that they are extracting and importing, they would get a large amount of revenue from this carbon tax. And that revenue, if it's given out as a dividend within their country, it's going to give them all a really juicy dividend. If you did the same policy in a country that uses a lot less carbon, like Malawi or Burundi, for instance, people use so little carbon there that, I'm saying carbon, I mean fossil fuels. People use so little fossil fuels that there would be hardly any revenue from the tax. And so when people get their dividends, they would get shit all, like people get shit all in those countries in almost every situation. Okay, so the policy that I'm going to put forward as a climate justice proposal is an international carbon cap, tax and dividend. So there is absolutely no justification for these schemes to be national rather than international, other than pessimism. And this is why I'm an optimist, okay? I don't believe we need to do everything nationally. And I think in this particular case, it is absolutely essential that we don't. So if you have an international scheme, what you do is internationally, every single extractor of fossil fuels has to register with an international agency and buy permits for every ton of coal, barrel of oil, etc., that they extract from the ground. The amount of permits will be capped. The cap would lower each year until you reach net zero, and the amount that people have to pay for the permits would rise each year. The money from that goes into a huge international fund, like a global sovereign wealth fund. And then that fund gets invested in building the technology that we do need. So then we would effectively end up with a huge swathe across the world of wind farms, solar farms, and other projects that are effectively owned by the people of the world. Yeah, they're built by money from this investment fund. We own them. And then the income generated by selling the energy that they produce comes back into the fund and gets distributed as a dividend to every single person in the world. Okay, you might have seen the cards on your table. I'm from World Basic Income. We're obviously interested in distributing cash to every person worldwide. And this is one way that you can do it. So we have done some sums on this. And I'm delighted to tell you that the numbers are absolutely fantastic. So if we work on the basis that we need to stop digging up fossil fuels within 25 years, okay, and we start the cap where at the production level we have now and reduce it progressively over 25 years, that brings in so much money into the fund. And if that fund is then invested, that gives over, obviously it builds up gradually because the fund gets bigger year on year. Within about 10 to 15 years, every single person on Earth would be getting a dividend of about $23 per person per month. So we're talking adults and children. So a family of 4, you're getting nearly $100 per person per month. So This is not enormous money. This is nothing like the kind of dividends that people talk about in the US. They're like, oh my God, everybody here could get like $1,000 a month. It's like, yeah, because you use a ridiculous amount of fossil fuel, and that's not tenable for the world as a whole. But $100 for a family in at least half of the world's countries, and believe me, I like, both me and my partner are working part-time. We've got 2 little kids. $100 a month would not go amiss in our household either. This will be a huge step towards climate justice. So the goals that we talked about, you know, protecting the innocent and people that have contributed nothing to the problem. This is an actual cash payment that goes to people who, we should not forget, these are people that are already suffering the greatest impacts of climate change. So a lot of the countries on the lowest incomes have a large proportion of the population working in agriculture. You know, you're working in agriculture, climate change is hitting you year after year after year, and not in the kind of ways where you're going to get money from like a loss and damage fund. You know, there's not like a huge typhoon, like, you know, literally washing away your country. It's just that, you know, droughts that used to come every 15 or 20 years and that you could manage with accumulated savings are now coming every few years. And, you know, I think it's easy to forget when you don't work in agriculture what that means. If you get a drought, your entire year's income of your whole household just vanishes. That's it, it's gone. Imagine if your entire salary was just taken away one day, it's just gone over for the whole year, you know, and you're already somebody that's scraping by with, you know, with practically no resources, practically no savings. You know, the kinds of impacts we're talking about that people are suffering from climate change are extreme, but they're people who have no voice, and they're people who have minuscule incomes. So we work with partners all over the world. Our partner in Malawi, we've been talking about doing a project where we fund a basic income pilot and use it as a basis for advocacy there. He said that incomes in Malawi, a woman would be, you know, would normally struggle to earn about £5 cash a month. And if somebody's making about £20 cash, they're considered to be like really making money. You know, so we're talking about something that could be of massive benefit to people that are beyond owed this. And at the same time, this policy would actually turn off the fossil fuel tap, right? Because you have to address fossil fuel production at the point of extraction. So much climate policy is about addressing demand, and that is important. But ultimately, if fossil fuels are entering the world economy, they're going to be sold and they're going to be burned. They're going to be used for something. I do appreciate, by the way, there are other things that cause climate change other than the use of fossil fuels, but it is the big one. So this policy, an international carbon cap, tax and dividend, has the potential to turn off the carbon tap, to make a huge pot of money that will keep on providing dividends forever. You know, so we're talking about this going to future generations as well. And that could fund a worldwide basic income or a worldwide dividend of sort of in the region of $100 a month for a family forever. And that would effectively end extreme poverty and extreme deprivation. It would redistribute resources. It would be the beginnings of a kind of reparations for the abuse that rich countries have done to the planet and to the peoples of the world. In that way, I think it is the most direct approach to climate justice that we can possibly take. Now, the reason you need to be an optimist on this is a lot of people, when you say about something like this, they say, you're talking about like global government. And part of me is like, well, I don't know. I'm talking about global redistribution. I'm talking about getting our shit together on a worldwide level, collaborating properly as nations, attacking companies, making them buy the permits. Yes, in that sense, you need to be an optimist because that sounds like a lot of work and it wouldn't be easy, but it is what's necessary. And I'm tired of going to talks like this where the main message, the thing that everybody says is we need to take some concrete action, but no one will say what that concrete action might be. Well, here I am. Here's a concrete action. I want us to go and start demanding this of our leaders. This could be done next year if leaders decided to do it. It would achieve climate justice straight away.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, questions for Laura? Passion, specific action.
Yeah, sorry, I got a bit on my high horse there.
Starting question. Question.
Okay, so the second question first. I mean, basically, what's been found across the world is that when societies get better off, people tend to have fewer children, not more, because they're more economically secure. So it's and there's not really any evidence that people have children just to get these kinds of small benefits, or even large benefits, in fact. The first question of does it incentivize? Could you just repeat it?
Going out and getting as much out of the
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you'd have to you would have to have, yeah, it would be very difficult in the lead-in period to stop people digging it all up like right now. You would possibly have to announce that you were going to have something retroactive that started, you know, at the point of this announcement, for instance. And in terms of fossil fuels that have been dug up historically, my organization, we are proposing a number of different kinds of global taxes and fees and charges like this, one of which will be a global wealth tax on corporations and on individuals. And in that way, you capture some of the wealth that's been accumulated by people historically digging up and burning fossil fuels. So in that way, that is captured. If there was a neater way to capture kind of historic carbon emissions or extraction, that would be great too.
Thank you. Question over there, please.
Have you considered paying the dividend to local civic organisations as opposed to directly to individuals? My thought being that potentially a local organisation might be able to pool the resources so they can maybe build local infrastructure for the benefit of adaptation in a way that an individual could in a smaller amount.
I think ultimately, I feel like, of course, it would be great if people locally decided that that was the best use of their money. I feel like that's not a decision for me to take, that people ought to be building infrastructure rather than buying food, paying school fees, buying mobile phones, whatever they want to do. I feel that people can pool their money if they think that's what they want, if they think that's most appropriate to them. But I think that's the kind of decision that ought to be made locally. And I feel like if just getting money to every single person, I mean, trust me, I am a huge believer in public services, and you know, there's not a day goes by that I don't think maybe I should have started a campaign for a worldwide NHS or, you know, WHS, for instance. But I think ultimately we shouldn't be afraid of giving money to people. People know what they need. People know what they need. People know what's good for them. There's been tons of studies where people have been given cash. Cash is increasingly what's given to people in disaster situations, in humanitarian situations. And so if people want to pool it, basically they will and they can, but I wouldn't want to impose that on people from afar.
Okay, just one question for me, if I may, and then we'll move on to others. So I don't know how big your organization is, but I mean, who do you need as a partner? Because I mean, obviously yes, it is specific. It's a massive policy. It's fraught with controversy in many ways. So who is the dream partner to enable you to actually implement this?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, the first dream partner is the climate activism movement. So we are a tiny organization. I am our only employee. I'm paid 1 day a week, although I work quite a lot more than that. We are eking out our first donation. We only started up a few years ago. So first of all, we need to get you guys on board, and that's kind of why I'm here. We need the climate activism movement to be starting to talk about this, because I don't feel that there's much of I don't feel like there's a coherent plan, a coherent demand, other than a kind of generalized demand for action coming from the climate movement. I feel like if the climate movement was to say, governments, we want you to, you know, cap carbon and tax it, you know, that there will be a lot more momentum, rather than, you know, we're still in the kind of land of kind of tell us the truth, take action, you know, but we're not getting much more specific. So that's the first partner, is all of you guys and the organizations you're connected to and the rest of the organizations here. After that, it's the governments of the world, and we will be talking to them when we can.
Very good. Okay, thank you. So Father Lekule, do you want to say a few words?
Right. Yeah, not my comfort zone, because I'm used to preaching, and in those situations I may know what I'm saying or not, but in this one I'm just going to say some things are, which I know, which is my experience. There won't be very scientific or data around it, but just sharing my own journey here. First of all, I think if you are a Catholic and think about saying, let's talk about climate change, a few years ago would be, no, let's pray. And then things changed since Pope Francis came to be the Pope. And to me, he's the reason, part of the reason, very passionate and optimistic about the future move of the Catholic Church. Now, many of you may have heard about the encyclical he wrote, which is a little book, and he wrote it to the people of the church, 1.2 billion people who belong to the church, and said, this is what I'm writing for you to reflect on and act upon. And that is Laudato Si. How many have heard Laudato Si? Quite few, yeah. And Laudato Si, which starts with those first words of that encyclical, say, praise be to the Lord for the creation. So as soon as he finished, praise be to the Lord, he comes back, say, for what? For the creation. And in that, he continues, and then he starts explaining how we should feel so sorry that we've done damage to that which we say to God, thank you, and that is what he calls Sister Earth. He says, this sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her. And when he says harm done to the Sister Earth, he connects it with the poor as well, those who are underprivileged and may not be able to cope with the changing climate. So that has been touched upon by the other speakers as well. So Live Simply, which is a group which is in the parish and other areas of the church, is very much working on promoting that document to tell people this is urgent, this is part of our mission as a church, so we cannot just say, let's pray and look up to heaven because maybe this is the only heaven we've got. And the Pope has insisted on that very strongly. So when I was coming here, I know a number of friends said, where are you going? I said, to Glasgow. What kind of pilgrimage are you going to? I said, I'm going. That's why I'm wearing this New Jerusalem. Because there's hope here, New Jerusalem or Zion. And that's why I'm using this hat to highlight to my friends that it's the same as you saying, I'm going to the Holy Land because I'm very passionate. Huh? Promised land. That's right. So, but as soon as I started explaining to a few people about coming here, the whole thing has changed because a lot of people take interest to try and find out what it is. And I know this will continue not only tomorrow, next week, but for years to come, because Live Simply is now well supported by the church and church authorities. Now, back to personal experience, I mentioned where I come from, the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, not Kenya. Some people think Mount Kilimanjaro is in Kenya. And I grew up there, and my friend here, the organizer, the inspirational man here, has been there and has climbed twice as much as me, I think, but I'm the one who did faster than him. And go to the top. I climbed when I was 18, and then I climbed again 20 years later, which means I was, yeah. So I'm not going to tell you my age now, but 18, I go up on the mountain I've always seen as a child, covered in snow through half of the year, and most of the year it's a quarter or 2/3 with the permanent glaciers. And at that time I climbed, it was tough because it was very cold and we had to go over the ice and so on. 20 years later, I climbed and it was pathetic. It was so sad. I could hardly even reach where the permanent glaciers were 20 years earlier. So any of you would like to see the snows of Mount Kilimanjaro, they are saying now that maybe only how many years left?
10 or 15 years if nothing is done. So the issue of climate change and working on this is urgent to me. But it's more urgent also because over 1 million people around that mountain, including my uncles, my families, depend on it. Their lives depend on the springs and the waters which come from there. And over time, they were told, we were told, I was there, the snows of Kilimanjaro are melting, the glaciers is disappearing because you are destroying the forest. So we were forced to stop entering the forest, which was the main source of income for most people. I know half of my uncles depended on it for firewood, for timber, for feeding animals. So once they put that enforcement that we cannot go in, a lot of people ended up being poor. And they are told, it's good for you. It's good for you because the forest is regenerating, the snows are coming back. And we are now more than 30 years since they did that. And of course, things are getting worse. So what has been said earlier is very true to the people, to my people around Kilimanjaro. So the sacrifices they've made, which is to give up their source of income and other things, is minute to the impact it brings to the snows coming back. So as we know, scientifically, this is a responsibility of the whole world and especially the main polluters. And I think on that point of first, the justice for role, what was the second point, which was, you had the first one, the 3 points.
Polluter pays, yeah, protect the innocent.
Polluter pays, that's why I would say that is very important to reflect upon, because they are doing a sacrifice by giving up their source of income, but it's not bringing much change. How could those who emit more CO2 emissions into the air help them or help my people be able to survive or have at least some income in order for things to change? So for me, I will stop there, because I think with the church now being on board and explaining my own experience, I think this COP26, I hope, will bring changes that are needed to be felt by especially those who are very poor, like the people around Kilimanjaro and many other parts of third world countries. Thank you.
Ranging, any questions? Please.
What would help? What they're already doing some of it, which is like planting trees, stop cutting the trees from the forest. But planting trees demand also some source of, if people are very poor, they don't have enough money to feed their family, you can tell them 100 times, please don't cut that tree before it's matured. But the day they are very hungry, they'll just cut it down. So actually part of the Walk to COP26, which we've done, and those who are walking around the world, they are raising money to plant trees by every distance they walk. And it's a wonderful idea, but needs to be amplified to be able to help them plant trees, because they have enough to live on. And now who's to pay? I think Laura had very wonderful answers, and I hope we'll back her up and our organization to bring that change.
Very good. Any other questions?
Who owns the land?
around Mount Kilimanjaro, right? Yeah, around Mount Kilimanjaro, because of being green and productive, a lot of people have moved to settle there. So every piece of land is owned by individual families, but of course there's a demarcation between where people can live and where they cannot live. So at the moment, for the last 100 years or more than, I'm not sure, I mean 50 years, there's been a demarcation that people cannot live beyond this point. That's the what you call the national park, which is owned by the government. So the piece of land we live in gets smaller and smaller as the population increase. People move into the cities and so on. Oh yeah, the church has, owns some, set amounts of land over there, but I wouldn't say it's significant. Actually, they own more land in the drier parts of the country than on the green part. But every land, whichever land they own around Kilimanjaro, which is mainly the Catholic Church and Lutheran Church, because we're under Germans and British, those lands, whatever is produced there is for the parish and the population around the parish.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Jamie.
Thank you. And my highlight already is hearing Glasgow referred to as New Jerusalem. I think that's fantastic. It's not something quite often we use about the city, so I think we should build that into our future campaigning. I'm going to be one of those guys that we talked about who's not actually going to give you any concrete ideas, because I think we're hearing some really fantastic ones, and I really want to hear what's coming out of the room. But I just want to focus a little bit around language and how we put across some of these ideas we're looking at, because I think for me, that's where we start to see some of the opportunities to engage the wider population and make the kind of changes that we need to see. And I think there's three kind of key areas that I'd like to look around that. So one, I think, is and I think Sam's breaking down a bit earlier really covered this very well, but it's about blame. It's about where we put the system and who we hold responsible for the issues. So quite often we look at people's lifestyles, we look at the spending and the consumption they have. We talk about how we can be recycling more and we can be doing certain things. And we put it on a very individual level. We attack people. We quite often denigrate people for their lack of engaging with some of these processes, all of which puts the responsibility onto those individuals rather than the fact that the majority of the impacts we're seeing come from the systems that are in play. That we can change a lot of our individual behaviours, but actually if we're going to fully address the enormity of the challenge we face, it's through the wider economic, social, political systems that we have in place. It's the extractors, it's the companies, it's the expectations around how they act. But by putting that power, by separating people, we create a real undermining of the chance for a global response to this. We had an event at the RSA a couple of years ago with Sandrine Dixon de Clave from the Club of Rome, and she talked about seeing the real challenge is how you balance the priorities. And she said, this is generalizing wildly, but between movements like the Gilets Jaunes movement in France, who are trying to survive the week because of the economic insecurity that many people are facing, the threats that they see to their lives, and then generalizing younger people who are trying to survive the century and see that need for bigger change. But when people are struggling to feed their families, we've heard this touched on already, when your priority or your overarching pressure is to see how you get through that week, trying to engage people and holding people responsible, blaming them for these wider issues that largely they haven't created or they're not sustaining, I think actually undermines our opportunities for that greater cooperation and collaboration that we need to see. And I think that's why the framing of the just transition, something that we've talked a lot about here in Scotland, but I think we're starting to see growing in movement across the world, is so important. Recognizing that for some of these communities, the heritage, the tradition, the way that money has been brought into those communities for so long are in industries that cannot be sustained, that need to be taken away, but simply removing them and not supporting people through that transition creates a huge amount of harm and undermines the support. We saw so often in communities that had experienced major deindustrialization previously, that they were communities that were most open to populist attacks, to movements that actually undermine a lot of the changes we're trying to see. We need to be able to bring them with us. I thought it was really striking recently in the United States to see one of the major mining unions talking about the fact that they support the need to move away from the industries they're involved in, but asking for the support and the investment to help people with it. So I think it's critical that we find those combinations, those ways to bring people together, which I think, as I'll come back to in a minute, relates also to ensuring that we have as many voices as possible around the table. But ensuring that we bring those people, ensuring that everyone feels part of the solution, that they will be brought with it. And for me, I'm a major supporter of basic income, and I think we need to see, again, these ideas that give us that economic security that we can build on. If you have the capacity, the cognitive space to be able to survive and look to the future, then you'll be able to address some of the issues that we need to see. I think there's a major issue around where we see the urgency of the climate emergency. And I think it's been really telling that we've seen that language change most recently. The RSA, we like to take pride in, apparently, if you look in the Oxford Dictionary, I think the first use of the term sustainability was at an RSA lecture. Sustainability itself gave that idea that we could just keep things going. If we were just a bit better, then we'd be okay. We've moved beyond that now. The talk about net zero for us, we feel, is not enough. We have to go beyond net zero to the idea of an actual regenerative future, one that doesn't just stop disaster, but actually repairs the damage that we've done to the world and communities across it, that starts to bring people together into that. And I think that language, that understanding has to be a critical part of how we reframe this, that we're building those secure bases, but we're also thinking about the new approaches that we can take to build that better regenerative regrowth future. And I think we can see so often that our responses are framed in the thinking of the 20th century. So certainly here in Scotland and the UK, a lot of our very powerful social security and welfare state was created in that post-war period in a response to a world that doesn't exist anymore. We try to solve those problems that we face now. The beverages giants, for those who know of that part of British history, the giants are still there. The issues we face are there, but they've evolved and adapted. Our systems haven't changed with them. So it's about bringing those together, having that urgency, having that language that shows what we need to do now and what we're aiming for, rather than sustaining where we are and hoping for the best. And I think that final part is that bringing in of voices, ensuring that actually we do create a huge space and opportunity. And we're seeing it here at COP, but we need to build it out and sustain that, of actually hearing the different communities across the world and what they're experiencing. One of my concerns I sometimes feel about where we slip into with the discussion around the climate emergency is that there is a push very quickly to talk about restricting the need for travel, for engaging and connecting. Of course, we have to look at these issues, but we need to find the ways that we can still engage with other parts of the world. And the pandemic has shown us, for all that first and foremost, that's a human tragedy, has shown us our ability to respond quickly, has shown us the opportunities around global communications that exist and that we can start to make use of, where we can support other communities to engage with them, and has also shown how quickly that money that doesn't seem to exist at any other point can magically be brought to solve any problems we face. We need to capture that. I know our colleagues from After the Pandemic are here. One of the things that's really struck me, and going back to this idea of language, is how quickly the language that was sprung up in the beginning stages of the COVID-19 pandemic have been twisted and taken into other places. Building back better, creating a better future, very quickly has been used in some quarters to give us more of the same. And I think it's where we see these kind of movements that we've seen in Scotland with After the Pandemic, but we're seeing so in so many other places, that put that pressure, that retain the importance and vitality of the language that we have. So I think there are solutions out there. I think ideas, touched on the basic income and others, give us spaces to really start to challenge those underlying economic presumptions, systems and insecurities we face. But I think it's when we capture that language, when we ensure that the language is shaped by as many different voices and experiences as possible, and when we don't put them against each other, but actually recognize that many different people are experiencing huge challenges in many different ways here, I think that's where we create the space. We talked about through this pandemic, the idea of all being in the same storm, but definitely not being in the same boats. I think what we see, and we see this when we talk about the economy, when we talk about what a billionaire is, and actually the vast majority of us don't have the slightest clue of what that truly means as a scale of money. I think by bringing those voices, we'll start to realize quite how different many of our boats are, even if we're all facing many of the same challenges and storms. So hopefully through this today and through many of our other engagements at COP, but more importantly, beyond COP, we'll be able to bring those voices together. And I certainly look forward to learning from as many of your voices and experiences as possible. Thank you.
Jamie? We've got a local voice here.
It's good. Feel free not to ask any questions. It's just
Okay.
my accent. No one can understand.
What? Question for you then. So you talked about the fact that, you know, the just transition had been on the table in Scotland for quite some time. What have you done about it? Give us an example, maybe an action initiative.
Well, I think, and I hate to go on about it, it sounds like we're kind of ganging up around the basic income idea here, but it is one where we've seen a significant change in terms of discussions in Scotland. So I was first involved in discussions about basic income in 2016 in Scotland, where it was very much a fringe concept, wasn't under any discussion at all, to a stage where today the Scottish Government, the First Minister, has very publicly stated that basic income is an idea whose time has come and that she wishes to deliver in Scotland. But actually, one of the things that's happened most recently about that I think is really interesting is we're very good at rhetoric in Scotland, as in most places. We have world-leading climate change targets and ambitions. We're a very progressive, forward-thinking small country, and we want to change the world, which is great. But what does it look like, and what is the reality of that in practice? And I was really struck in the recent Scottish parliamentary elections we had here. I didn't watch any of the leaders' debates for my own health and sanity. And I was, during the first one, was making dinner. My phone started going crazy with colleagues on Twitter saying, "Oh, you'll be really pleased because 4 out of the 5 main party leaders have just expressed support for basic income." What was interesting that came out of that was that the Scottish Government announced that their goal for Scotland is a basic income for everyone in the country that would follow all the conditions, and we don't have time to go into those just now. But in the meantime, because that's not deliverable under current Scottish devolution context, they were going to look at a minimum income guarantee, which is the idea of giving a kind of minimum level that people can't fall beneath, very similar to a lot of policies we have in place just now. And I think what was interesting for me, and where it shows a kind of an element of action, is that it's not the end goal, it's not perfect, but there's still an ambition to do something in the meantime. So it doesn't you can easily focus on saying we want to deliver the perfect and you don't do anything in the meantime and nothing changes. You can also say we're going to do it purely incremental and not have a bigger vision, and actually then you stop at the first increment and nothing changes. To me, and the responsibility for all of us is to hold all of our governments to account to ensure that they do deliver that change. But for me, it was a combination of vision and incremental improvement, which actually can start to give us a degree of progress in that sense. But I think that the fact that the Just Transition Commission in Scotland has reported back that the findings of that are very much being built in, and that the language of discussion here is very rooted in this concept of both a recognition of Scotland's place in a global community, that we can't solve problems ourselves, purely by ourselves, but also in that need to bring people along on the journey, I think is a critical aspect of the discussion that we can share with other parts of the world as well.
Jeremy, thank you very much. So perhaps our fourth panelist, and then after that, remember, we're then going to turn our chairs around and have a conversation amongst ourselves. I will ask everybody to stand up and mix up a bit if you're sitting next to friends and family. So sit next to people you don't know. But Nicole, over to you.
Thank you. And I just managed to go at the front of the stage without falling off, which is a first for me. So hi, everybody. And thanks, Sam. And thank you for being invited to speak on this panel. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about what it means to be a councillor and what councillors can do and local authorities can do. So I am a Green Party councillor in Lambeth. I'm one of 5 councillors, Green councillors, which means that we are the official opposition in Lambeth. And this has given us quite a lot of power in a way, but we are not decision makers, but we have been able to really, really change the narrative in the room over the last 3.5 years since there's been a few of us. And I'm sorry, I have made notes because I've got quite a lot that I want to say in a really short amount of time. So please forgive me that I'm going to refer to notes. I want to, the whole idea of climate justice, we've been talking about it on a global scale, on a national scale. I want to talk about a little bit more on a sort of local scale. So, and we are talking about social justice, racial justice, and gender justice, and also the need to safeguard the rights of children and young people and the most vulnerable in society when we develop local policy and make decisions and anything that addresses climate change, as we've been talking about. So it's what we were talking about when we refer to a just transition and the creation of things like green jobs and approaches such as donut economics, the polluter pays, and also universal basic income. So we need our local decision makers to be thinking and planning ahead. Back in 2019, Lambeth was the first London borough to declare a climate emergency. And at that time, they pledged to become carbon zero by 2030 in their operations, but not necessarily borough-wide. Now, of course, in our motion, the Green Party motion, we were asking for borough-wide zero, carbon zero by 2030. But they have at least stuck to the pledge to organise a citizens' assembly. The citizens' assembly was held online this year, and we have just received the recommendations. 80-page document, 13 recommendations. The whole document needs to be read and acted upon. Not the 13 recommendations which feel a little bit like they've been handpicked. It's like, oh yes, we can do that one. That fits in with current policy. So it's really, really important that we're there to hold them to account, to say, actually, you need to carry through on all of these pledges which have been put into this climate emergency motion to reach carbon zero and create a climate action plan which is borough-wide, community-led, and feels like it's been created and therefore owned by all of the residents, the businesses, the organisations, the health trusts within Lambeth. Now, our council will say, there's not much we can do. There's actually a lot that they can do. And especially, and I'm just going to run through some of the areas that any local authority has influence on in order to combat sort of mitigating factors and also reduce carbon emissions. So housing is probably the biggest one. In Lambeth, 1/3 of our emissions come from housing. So we really need to look at insulation, retrofitting, and so on. So ideas around that would be, not only do we need to lobby government to be asking for national funds to be made available to insulate homes across the whole of the UK, but we also need to be looking at encouraging private owners and private landlords to be doing the same thing. So maybe offering grants and funds and reductions on that. Local energy projects. So actually creating energy locally for the people. And you would hope that eventually maybe you could even become self-sufficient as an area. Things like small business, so encouraging small businesses by reducing business tax. Policies to reduce waste and consumption from the smallest home to the biggest hospital. So they can impact all those sorts of things. So introducing financial incentives for local businesses to hit sustainability targets. So you would say, right, if you reach a certain level of maybe reducing your waste from packaging and so on, then you could get a reduction in your business tax. What else have I put? So putting practical plans in place to meet the need to mitigate and adapt to climate change. This is around flooding. We've had exceptional rainfall across London, including in Lambeth. We've had flooding in places that never have been flooded before. We need to be able to adapt to that and be able to mitigate against it as well. And cross-borough engagement in creating the climate action plan. And also the council has a huge role in communications. They're the one organisation in any local authority that can actually contact everybody and pass for information sharing, but also for facilitating. And then we have the local plan. So every area will have a local plan. And it's for everybody within an area to ensure that that local plan has the climate emergency embedded within it. And then, of course, greening projects, which is probably it's everybody's heart. So more tree planting, more allotments, more hedges, more rewilding of spaces, and so on. And so if anybody's got questions about what can happen locally, please do ask.
Questions about this? Nicole?
Right, well, I'm pleased to say that it's not me. And if I was in charge, I would absolutely change the planning. In fact, yeah, this is one of the areas that a local council can only really make a few little changes. Planning policy comes from national government, and it's glacially slow at changing. So you can change maybe a few technical specifications, but apart from that, their hands are tied. And it is so frustrating, and it's as frustrating for you as it is for us as opposition councillors and for the decision makers who run the council. So yeah, completely sympathise.
Okay. So no,
Sorry, say that, but will that be place in there?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. In Lambeth, we have a local plan which fails to mention climate emergency as a pillar within the most important areas that we need to address. So it means that they have no statutory obligation to meet any of those promises that our administration are currently making about tackling the climate emergency. So where everybody can impact this, so in your area, you can contact your council and say, I'm very concerned about what is or isn't within the local plan, and I would like to feed into it directly. And you have every right to do that, as does every single community group or organisation. But local plan, so in London, the local plan it's sort of a bit of a chain of command. So the borough plan, borough plan, comes from the mayoral plan. So it's a London-wide plan, and they all have to feed into each other and sort of, marry together so they make sense. Absolutely. We have, so I'm a councillor in Streatham, we have a neighbourhood plan. And again, that sort of fits in with the local plan.
okay, thank you. So one more question and then we'll.
I think for me, it's creating green jobs. So where we're going to lose some of the some people from the workforce because of this move into greener industry. So it's sort of this green economic recovery, which means that maybe we can create more traineeships, apprenticeships, and green jobs. We need to be, if we're going to retrofit all of these homes, we don't at the moment have a workforce to do that. So there's huge potential here to be able to create around job creation and job training. So that's one aspect of just transition.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So, we heard obviously about basic income, and we heard about the importance of sort of sustaining things about livelihoods. We heard about language. We've heard about sort of planning and that sort of local authority level. So, lots of different components to this. So now, please, let's get sort of little groups of 4 and 5. Yeah, reflect on this, what you've heard. Reflect, share your own opinions on the climate transition. We want to then share those back. The most important thing is obviously to meet new people. So you two at the back, I know you know each other very well, very well. So please sit with people you don't know. Okay, 4 or 5 people around the table, please. Let's have just 20 minutes, get to know each other, talk about the climate transition. Okay. Okay, everybody, sorry to break up the conversations, but maybe it would be great. It would be great to hear a little bit about what people are talking about between the tables. So, hello, the Bulls. Yeah, so it'd be great just to hear, just to share a little bit about the conversation, the nature of the conversation, some of the topics. Hello in the back. We good? Yeah. So do you want to start by sharing a little bit about what you've been just discussing briefly? Oh, anybody give a particularly good introduction?
And so at that point in time, it was to say, well, we would like to see more active travel, get people out of the cars. And of course, the council said, well, it costs a lot of money. And so, well, this is a lot of rubbish because you don't have a plan. If you don't have a plan, how can you get money? Now we know, so this is finding out later on that nationally that the government has invested about 2 billion, or set aside 2 billion towards active travel. So you can't have it's called an LC WIT, a local cycling and transport infrastructure. If you do not have one of those in your council, then I would move towards getting that in your own council, so that you have a plan, and then from that plan you can get money from whoever's going to sponsor it. So that's what we've just got, just from last year, and we just implemented or created some time.
Very good. Thank you. Any other table? Share what they've been talking about. This one over here. Hung, your table. Anything exciting to impart? Oh, really? Okay. Okay. Kevin, anything?
Or did talk about the fact that no more than 10% of the population fly. So, you know, that's 90%. So if extensions are talking about maintaining the right to fly, then they're part of the agreement.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, move on. Right, thank you. Lola, Kumi, anything from your table? Very good, thank you. So, yeah, right.
We spoke a little bit, but we didn't come up with a solution.
Oh, come on.
Back to the discussion of basic income. And from a fairness perspective, whether it would be basic income that would be the same per capita across different nations, or whether it would be different relative cost of living. Because a country or a place with a high cost of living would get a relatively small amount of money, because that's the average globally. They can do very little with that. However, get more to the privilege where now is higher, then are you rewarding people in places that are very polluting more? And yet they need more money if you want to empower them with an agency to change where they live, where they live. So we were just having a debate around some of the mechanics possibly of this basic parity, or does it reflect relative?
Yeah, and the lady, I've forgotten her name, the lady who left, who was the professor of sustainability, I think, at Strathclyde University. So she just sort of added to that, and I guess, and said, it's not much good if you, close a mill or a factory or a sector which a local community is dependent on and expect them to get $23 a month or whatever. I mean, so yeah, reflecting on that, and reflecting on obviously the amount raised and then how it's distributed, absolutely critical to allow it to actually be implemented effectively. At least Laura's got the answers. Natasha, Graham, Fortune.
Yeah, we're mostly talking about land ownership. So from Scotland, there's a statistic of 50% of the population, 50% of land in Scotland. So that is something that last 5 years has been a lot of conversation about land ownership, who owns land, and how communities get access to land, which is for the cities. So heading off from Glasgow, if you've been walking around Glasgow, it's obviously from an architectural perspective, but from a green space, it's actually like the centre is realistically has very, very minimal amount of green space. People come back into the office, working in the city centre, have lost that connection that during the pandemic a lot of people had to their green space, to their green space, like worked in, and the I guess that's the pure plug, something we're doing, is we've got a solution for Glasgow. It's an online tool that you can use to comment on the lands that is in there. Some people were like commenting on the motorway and being like, get rid of it. But then in other cases, it's like really productive, like conversations that wouldn't necessarily happen from a council perspective, because it's something that's like we're trying to do. And yeah, some of the conversations are around the majority of them are actually around how climate emergency is affecting people are reflecting on that part of it. So that's kind of where
Sorry, I rudely interrupted. And by the way, the point about people spending time on the introductions, personally, I think that's a great thing. And from the walk that we've done, I think the introductions, the connections we've made are probably the most important thing that we've left. So I think it's a good thing. Finally, the panelists, before we ask me to take the stage.
we had some really interesting discussions around all the Catholic Church, but I think faith communities can play in a lot of the discussions, which I think was really interesting, and seeing some of the barriers that are there, but also the fact that they give you a structure and a community to tap into. So I think I sort of found that really interesting hearing your examples of within your parish and the community you've been working with.
Anything to add, man? Excellent. All right. Well, give yourself a big hand. Do you want to come up? Do you want to stand where you are? Whatever you want.
Hi, everybody. I guess all that stands between you and some warm beverages is probably what I have to say. So let me try and be brief. So let me just start by making a light comment, which is not intended to be so light. And that is, I'm much more nervous speaking to people these days than when I was a 15-year-old activist against the apartheid regime in South Africa, my home country. And the reason for that is best told through a story. Speaking to a group of folks in the United States, mainly from foundations and trusts a couple of years ago, I was going on about how we have a convergence of crises, economic inequality, gender inequality, the climate crisis, and so on. And during the Q&A time, a rather unhappy delegate put up a hand and said, Mr. Naidu, have you heard of Martin Luther King? And I said, yes, he inspired me and many other young people in South Africa when we were fighting apartheid. And then she said, do you know what his most famous speech was called? Sort of, anybody? Yeah, so me thinking it's like a trick question, I answered it very gently. I said, I have a dream. And she shouted back at me. She said, yes, it's I have a dream, but when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a bloody nightmare. The oceans are collapsing, the forests are disappearing, inequality is rising, and so on. So in the story lies the challenge of the moment that we find ourselves in. How can we speak truth to power? And how can we not sanitize things on the one hand, but how can we do it in a way that also does not immobilize, demotivates, and get people feeling that it's already too late? So I just wanted to start by saying that one of the things that has informed my activism over time has been this notion that the pessimism of your analysis, that however bad your analysis of whatever injustice you're trying to address, the pessimism of your analysis can best be overcome by the optimism of your action. So I just want to say to all those of you who walked, can you just put up your hands, please? Did everybody walk? I think those of us who didn't walk should give them a round of applause. Because I think there's a desperate need for us to find creative, productive activities that takes us out of the spirit of pessimism. Because let's be blunt about it. We are living in the most consequential decade in humanity's history. What we choose to do right now in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future humanity have, or whether humanity will have a future at all. And I do not believe that that is an hyperbolic statement, right? That's the reality. Our leaders know this. And by the way, they've known it long before we knew it, right? There's documented evidence that the CEOs of the fossil fuel companies were sitting with their own internal research for decades that told them that burning of carbon dioxide was going to create the kind of situation that we are heading to right now. So when we talk about what is climate justice, actually, it's worth answering the question, what is climate injustice first, before we can really answer the question, what is climate justice? So the one climate injustice that we have in every country across the world is that climate change constitutes the biggest betrayal of intergenerational solidarity that we've ever seen at any moment in our history, right? Our generation, or the older generation, and unfortunately I'm in that generation now, or fortunately, have been living as if we don't have kids and grandkids coming behind us. We have been depleting, destroying, decimating ecological assets that humanity needs for its survival, right? And we have, and this is the irony, because in virtually every culture around the world, we all value our children. You know, the way you spoke about your two children, I felt like that 1-year-old and 3-year-old, I would really like to go and hang out with them. And how does it feel to have a crazy mom who's got crazy ideas about, you know, like rethinking the world like in a fundamental way? But, you know, irrespective of whether you come from Africa, Asia, Latin America, but yet that common thing that binds us in terms of how it took our children to take to the streets. It took our children to take to the streets and leave school to actually prick the kind of consciousness. And yet we're not even at the point where sufficient numbers of those in power recognize how serious the problem is. So I'll come back to the other elements of climate injustice in a second, but just to say, you know, after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, what was the approach of those in power? It was system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. But what was needed then, and even needed more urgently even today, is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. And in that sense, some of the ideas that the panel put on the table is the kinds of ideas that we have to actually elevate, expand, and to use a word we used to use in South Africa, massify, you know, make, it's not a real word, but we used it often in South Africa. We say we need to massify our movements. That's the only way we'll defeat the apartheid regime. So, but the second aspect of climate injustice is not a comfortable one for a country that has a colonial history, but it has to be addressed. The people that are paying the first and most brutal impacts of climate change are those that have contributed least to it. The African continent, for example, is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. My country, South Africa, by the way, is an exception. It's the 12th largest emitter. In fact, if you take South Africa out of the equation, the African emissions comes to about 1%, you know, in terms of global contribution. But the people that are dying first and foremost are people who have contributed least to the problem. So I just want to tell you, how many of you, if I say 1.5 degrees, it means something to you? Please put up your hands. Okay. By the way, those of you who don't have your hands up or hesitantly, it's not your fault. Because let me tell you, the biggest challenge to the climate movement, the biggest obstacle to winning is the climate movement. Because we talk in ways that cannot connect to ordinary people. I remember in 2015 being in the Pacific. I was then the head of Greenpeace International. And I was in a country called Kiribati, spelled Kiribati, right? And sorry, are you from Kiribati? Oh, okay. So that would be a long shot because the population size of Kiribati is quite small. Oh, you're laughing because you're South Africa, okay. So, okay. So I was in Kiribati, in Tuvalu, and in Fiji, and I learned a new slogan that even somebody who's been around for so long, it like really kind of, it tugged at my heart, and I had to go into the bathroom and shed a couple of tears and come back into the meeting. I'd never heard the slogan before. People were going 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. These are Pacific Island nations which are almost guaranteed to be wiped off this planet, right? If we do not keep things below 1.5. Then I meet them 6 months later at the climate negotiations in December 2015. And they pull me to go and speak at some rally that they got permission within the negotiations. And I go there and I thought, okay, you know, I learned the slogan, you know, 1.5 to stay alive. And I go 1.5 to, and they say, shh, the slogan has changed. And you know what the new slogan was? 1.5, we might survive. 1.5, we might survive, because already, I saw it with my own eyes, already Sea level rise is taking away places where people used to grow vegetables, where their homes are, and so on. So the bottom line is that the people of the global south, right? And here's a more uncomfortable word to put in the conversation, but it has to be put for an honest conversation. We're not simply dealing with climate injustice. We're dealing with the reality of climate apartheid. Okay? If you look at which parts of the world carry the biggest responsibility historically, which are predominantly parts of the countries that are paying the first and most brutal price, it's people who have countries that have people of color, right? And so, but the thing that I've always tried to do is to try to encourage people to understand that analysis, but go beyond it, right? Because it doesn't serve us, because see, history, if you de-historicize a problem, you're never going to fix it. But if you allow history to hold you back and throttle you to death, it's also not helpful, right? But if you don't acknowledge, you don't take the first step, right? So basically though, climate change, ironically, I would argue, offers us one of the biggest opportunities to address a range of injustices and challenges that humanity has faced. For far too long, we've lived in a world that has been divided based on developed and developing, north and south, east and west, rich and poor. If there's one thing that should bring us to our senses, is the reality of climate change. That we either get this right as rich and poor nations acting together, and hopefully we secure the lives of the majority of people on this planet. But if we get it wrong, true, people in poor countries are going to disappear and are disappearing first. But ultimately, the rich will not be protected. As the people of Germany and Belgium found out just months ago when more than 200, 300 people died in floods, right? So what we need to push at this negotiations is for our leaders to find common ground, to build solidarity, and to actually push their thinking on a level of innovation that they have not been able to do. Now, it's Laura, right? Laura, I wrote something down that you said, and I think I'm not going to find it, but you said something about, it's just because BBC would have snapped off the one. You said something in your thing about getting our shit together, right? You said that, right? So let me just say, I just want to be a bit light. I know it's been a long day and so on, right? So when we think about, I'm gonna come to the shit in a second, but basically, if I can just bullet point what actually climate justice really means if we are going to seek it moving forward, right? And basically, what we need to be doing is recognizing that from where we are, we've got like a mountain to climb to get anywhere close to where we can get our political and economic responses to align to what the science and what extreme weather events are saying. I mean, the sad truth is today, we don't even need the science, actually. We can just look at the extreme weather events. They're off the charts. They're completely off the charts. And yes, you know, the climate denialists, those that remain, will say things like, oh, we've always had hurricanes and we've always had typhoons and we've always had droughts and but everything we are now seeing is way off the charts. Record after record after record is broken. So just to summarize then, the term climate justice acknowledges that climate change can have differing social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts on underprivileged populations. Climate justice refers to an economically and socially just response to climate change, which should include the following elements. First, recognizing that climate change is a human rights issue and justice issue, rather than simply a technical and a scientific issue, right? And when I say the climate movement is partly to blame for the lack of success, what I mean by that is the climate movement only recently has brought a human-centric approach to climate change. It was almost as if, you know, it's something to do with the science and environment and all of that, and not related to water, to air, to soil, to allotments, to greeneries in, you know, in our local community, and so on. So that is a challenge that I believe is within our capability of fixing right now. Then radically reducing emissions through equitable consumption and equitable carbon budget allocations. So now, yeah, I want to just stop. You know, there are many environmentalists and NGO folks, you know, don't want to say that we have to address the question of population. I want to say we have to address the question of population, and this addressing the question of population does not have to be sort of Western cultural preferences and all being brought into it. Basically, if we empower women, right, and give women real economic status in their lives, then population sizes start coming down, right? So it's not rocket science to address it. It's something that we need to do. Politicians know this, but they have been reluctant, right? But just so you know, when I used to go and talk to Greenpeace volunteer meetings, when I used to be there for about 6 years, one of the questions that used to come up, especially in the US actually, from volunteer groups, and these are Greenpeace volunteers, they're not like the enemy. They put up their hand and say, Kumi, what you doing about population size? You know, and then I say, explain to me what's your concern. They say, yeah, no, people in Africa, Asia, and so on are having too many babies. But here's the reality. It takes the consumption of about 100 African kids to equal 1 kid in the UK, right? So it's not simply an issue of population size, it's about what consumption. And the problem is there are some people in our world that are consuming far too much, and there are some people in our world who are consuming virtually nothing. And they are the ones that are paying the price of the climate crisis. Rich countries and the rich sectors within countries need to also be taking responsibility for financing the transition to a clean, renewable energy and providing assistance to poor nations and communities as they adapt to climate change and economic transitions. Another thing, if you're going to be serious about climate justice, is avoid solutions that burden the poor and vulnerable communities, right? Whether it's in rich or poor countries, right? You will find, and that's what happened with the Gilets jaunes, if I'm saying it right, in France, right? There was not proper consultation and so on, and the state just moved ahead and on an environmental measure, and then you got mass resistance against it because you didn't carry the people with you, and you're passing the burden on the poorest. Another thing about climate justice is prioritizing the solutions suggested by the people most impacted. Do not underestimate the power and the wisdom of people who live under a particular problem. And that brings me to shit. So, sorry to you saying, we need to get our shit together. So I say this a little bit of a light story, right? But like when just before I joined Greenpeace, I was a visiting professor in Uppsala, Sweden. And the day I arrived there, my Swedish friend was going to come and take me out for dinner. And he arrived about 45 minutes late. Now, I don't know whether you know about that part of the world. If you arrive 5 minutes late, it's like you've killed somebody, right? They're serious about, you know, punctuality. So I had a long apology, and the apology included a reason why he was late. And the reason he was late was that he was at he said, you know, I'm a volunteer on the Uppsala bus management company, and we're having a big problem that we face. And then I said, what was the problem? He said, we run our buses here on human feces, which was something that was shocking to me in 2009. I had no clue that this was possible. I said, what do you mean human feces? He said, I don't know, shit, crap, poo, whatever you want to call it. And I said, so what's the problem? He said, well, we've run out of shit here in our municipality. We're trying to negotiate to get shit from the neighboring municipality, and they want to charge us so much for their shit as if their shit is a little more special than our shit. So the next day I go to the central station, bus station at Uppsala, because I never heard about it. I'll be honest, you know, this is before I joined Greenpeace, I didn't know. So I was breathing very heavily to see whether there was any bad smells coming out of the buses. Beautiful smell, no problem. And then a couple of months later, here in Bristol introduces a poo bus, they call it, which is what runs between Bath and Bristol. So I had the occasion to address some leaders on the African continent on the 50th anniversary of the Organization of African Unity. So I tell the story exactly as I told it so far. But which stage I'm like, shit, I've lost most of these people, right? Because they don't know whether to laugh and then I said, listen, the reason I tell you this story is simple. I refuse to accept that Europe, Uppsala and Bristol are 2 European cities, of course. So I said, I refuse to accept that European shit is better than African shit. We just have to get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity. And I genuinely believe that if we can mobilize the political will, whether it is the basic income grant for everybody globally, whether it is about a vision of a local government like you presented, where there's a rewilding and so on, which can improve the quality of our air, so our children are not ending up polluted before they are, lungs being polluted before they are 16 and so on. I genuinely believe that there's a possibility of turning this thing around. But yes, let me conclude with the challenge. The challenge is we have a very small window of opportunity. And that window of opportunity is fast closing. And see, if you take gender inequality as a challenge, right? It's pathetic, the level of gender inequality that we have in the world, given how much of struggles, how many lives of amazing women who've led the struggle and so many decades and decades. But with gender inequality, there isn't a clock in the center of the table saying, you got to solve gender equality within such a time. With climate change, we are facing a clock. And that clock is saying, once we get to a certain point, and the words the scientists use is very important to take notice. They say irreversible, catastrophic. Actually, they say it the other way, catastrophic, runaway, irreversible climate change, right? And once we hit a certain tipping point, all the weather systems and so on go wacko. And I'll just conclude by saying, I come from Southern Africa. 2 years ago, some of you might remember, hopefully you remember, there were cyclones. We never had cyclones before. And that cyclone wiped out an entire city in Mozambique called Beira. Google it and go look at Beira and the cyclone. We never had cyclones before. So let's be clear. Time is against us, and what the current moment calls for is not rearranging the deck chairs as humanity sinks and incremental tinkering on the sides. What is needed is massive structural and systemic change. And I want to just end by this meeting taking place here. Don't be disappointed that they're not going to deliver what we need them to deliver, right? Don't be disappointed, right? Because they're not going to deliver what is needed. Because the politics and the economics, I mean, do you know that your government here in the UK was having secret meetings with the fossil fuel industry? The very company that's running the bloody COP, right? One of the companies providing thing is actually somebody is from within the fossil fuel industry and so on. And that they were part of colluding to get the IPCC to take the words out of the report naming fossil fuels. And do you know the IPCC largely took out most of the words? Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And here's the thing. And I'm so glad you said that. Thank you. Whatever the IPCC says in their scientific assessments, they come out every 5 years on average, right? And you go back and look at what they said each 5 years and what happens in the next 5 years. It's always what they say is less worse than it turns out to be, right? Because what does IPCC stand for? Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So every government has its scientists there. And when the facts are inconvenient, the governments have been saying to them, water it down, water it down, water it down. But even now, this watered down assessment that they've given is telling us we all should be shaking in our boots because we're running out of time. So and the attacks on civil society, on activism, and so on, has never been as high, even in this country, right? If you look at how they're going after activists who are engaged in peaceful civil disobedience around climate, it's pathetic. And if those of you didn't see, what is that Mogg, what's his name? Rees-Mogg. So what's his name? What's his title? He's a leader of the House. So he got asked 4 days ago in Parliament. Do you know the UK was put by an organization called Civicus World Alliance for Citizen Participation that monitors the shrinking space for civil society. And the UK was added onto their watch list because of what's happening with freedom of assembly. And Rees-Mogg said the way he dealt with it is like all dictators do. He said, oh, that's a silly organization, never heard of them, don't care about them, right? But I wouldn't want to end on an optimistic note. Now, there's something, just on a lighter note, there are two people that are often quoted. You'll hear things that say Einstein said this and Gandhi said this. Quite often you must go and Google it to just double check, because quite often Gandhi didn't say it and Einstein didn't say it, right? So this is something that was attributed to Gandhi, and I must make a confession here. I used to always quote it as what Gandhi said until Donald Trump quoted the same thing. And when Donald Trump said it, then somebody pointed out that it was not true. It turns out it was from a labor leader, a trade union leader in the early 20th century, in about 1908. He said, first, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. And then you win. The good news is, what you are doing, what many millions of people around the world, is not being ignored, it's not being laughed at. In fact, it's being fought at. Governments are trying to dismiss it as irrelevant. Sometimes where people engage in peaceful disobedience, they're being very tough and so on. And let's hope, whether it was Gandhi or whether it was the labor leader in the United States, if they were right, that we are one step away from securing a way forward that hopefully can protect the lives of the majority people on the planet. And let's be very clear. The struggle is not about saving the planet. The truth is, the planet actually is fine. I know this sounds crazy to say. The planet actually is fine. Because if we continue on the path that we're on and warm up the planet the way we are, the end result is we will be gone. The planet will still be here. And the good news, if everybody is worried about the planet, once we become extinct as a species, the oceans will recover, the forests will grow back. So don't worry about the planet. Understand that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more and nothing less than protecting our children and their children's futures. And it is within our capability to do that. If we can get every parent on this planet, every grandparent on this planet to start thinking about their children and their futures and standing up and acting for that, if we can do that, I think we can generate enough political will to make massive changes in a very short space of time. We don't have a choice but to believe that that's within the domain of possibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for participating. Thank you for the panelists, and a special thank you to you. So if you're staying around for 2 weeks, have a great 2 weeks. Create some change, create some pressure, and let's stay optimistic. Cheers.